warm welcome and good afternoon to all of you. I'm happy to see that this is our fourth in the speaker series, and several of our, if I may call, alumni speakers, former speakers are here with us today. And we're also very happy we have with us guests who have come all the way from Indonesia to join us, and also an eminent publisher here who published our first book from GAI, which I'll introduce in a moment. Many of you may not have heard about the Global Asia Institute, so allow me to do a few introductory remarks to clarify what the Global Asia is about and what it entails to do. So you're all very much important party to the Global Asia Institute. The Institute was announced by the NUS President about a year ago, last year, when at the State of the University address he raised the issue of how to pursue thought leadership from NUS and how to position ourselves in the current situation that Asia is facing. Asia is growing very rapidly, urbanizing as well, which is the subject of our discussion today. However, it comes with its opportunities, also challenges, which we need to look at from various angles. And we have looked at it as three strands of these angles. The first one is the world is having pressure on Asia in terms of how the globalized world will let Asia react and respond to. So that's the first theme from a macroeconomic perspective. The second one is the changes in Asia that is happening is slightly different in terms of the timetable and in terms of the ways that Asia is transforming itself, which is the urbanized Asia. Much of the transformation in Asia is happening far more rapidly than the Northern American countries and European countries took to take shape. The third and the most important aspect of this trend that is happening in Asia is that how are the citizens and how are the city planners and the managers able to cope with these two mega trends. In that sense, how are they able to provide the basic services, starting with water, sanitation, electricity, housing and education and health services to these citizens who are now living in Asia and mainly in the cities. So these three themes kind of drive the research agenda for the NUS Global Asia Institute. However, being a university where we do research on a wide range of disciplines, starting from medicine to finance to other subjects, we also have a concept that we want to cluster the discussions. Some of the institutes, in fact, our partner today for the speaker series is the Asia Research Institute. They already have the concept of clustering their research topic. The Global Asia Institute wants to do something like clustering the cluster. Some of these may look very abstract, but academics can live with a lot of these abstract concepts. The idea is to look at what are the very complex issues which require more than one domain expertise or discipline to actually go and talk about it. We want to be careful that in our pursuit of this complex topic, we do not want to end up being fluffy. So at the same time, we also want to encourage deeper research. So that is the aspiration of the Global Asia Institute. In doing so, we want to partner from within the university, within Singapore. I'm very happy to see today we have colleagues from other universities in Singapore, also the government agencies, but also beyond Singapore with research centers, with a stronger focus on India, China, not because of anything else, that these two countries will mean a lot for the future of Asia and the way as how the global trends are impacting Asia. What happens in these two countries will also impact what happens to Asia and the rest of the world. A little bit about what we have done in the recent past. On the 28th of June, we had a round table on a book that we actually launched on the 24th of June called Developing Living Cities. And I'll give you a few slides on what this book is about. It looks at the urbanization that is happening all around the world and the clusters that are emerging. I think today's conversation is very much a case in point in that. And what we found out is development in Asia, or development per se, is always accompanied by urbanization. However, when the development and the urbanization is not complemented by the other angle that is important, which is the human development that needs to happen, because you can gain income, which is the macroeconomic growth, and that development will result or will nurture the urbanization, and it feeds back to itself. But if we don't substitute that with proper redistribution of the wealth and redeployment of the resources to provide the various services that the cities and the citizens will need, we may be having stunted growth, or we may be having problems which are beyond the coping capacity of the national or the local government. So today's discussion, I think, very relevant to that. A little bit of giveaway from the book. I hope you will all, because the publisher is here, I cannot give away free things from the book. So you please will get the book, I suppose. But the book has a framework which looks at 6 dimensions to make cities living. In a way, it's a kind of an acronym. So C stands for the competitiveness, I for infrastructure, T for transport, broadly mobility, then I for information, which makes the city intelligent, then environment, which comprises air, water, and sanitation, and other natural greeneries and so on. And most importantly, the last but not the least, shelter, that is housing for all the citizens and the people who dwell and work in the city. So this framework provides a comprehensive way to look at all the dimensions that we need to look at for the long-term sustainability and the future of the cities. At this point, let me welcome once again the speaker for today, Professor Michael Douglas. He right now is visiting the National University of Singapore at the Asia Research Institute. But however, his parent position is at the University of Hawaii, where he's a professor for urban and regional planning, and he's also an executive director for the Globalization Research Center. He will talk to us about globalization, mega projects, and the urban ecology, specifically on what is happening in Jakarta in Indonesia. However, his experience and in the several years covers Japan, South Korea, and other countries in Asia, including Vietnam. We will be later joined by another colleague, also from the Asia Research Institute, who is Professor Kusno Abidin from Indonesia, and he will complement and help us have a dialogue later. In his own research, he comes actually from the University of British Columbia. He's also visiting the National University of Singapore, where he is a professor at the Institute of Asian Research. So with that, let's welcome Professor Michael Douglas to make his opening remarks. For those of you who are new to this dialogue, we will have first a lecture for about 30 to 40 minutes by Professor Douglas, and later we will have a conversation where you all will participate by asking them intelligent, difficult, and interesting questions. So please think about good questions, because we want as many of you to participate in the discussions that will happen after his lecture. So Professor Douglas, please.
Thank you very much for the kind introduction. I'm glad it's not dirty, difficult, and dangerous, which is part of the migration story that we always hear about. Today, as the title says, I'm going to try to link globalization with the question of flooding that's occurring now chronically in not only Jakarta, but throughout the region. My interest in this started more than 20 years ago when I was living in Jakarta, working for the United Nations on a big national urban development strategy project. During that time, I got interested in the idea that urban form, the shape and content of a city as it develops, has a relationship to environmental management. So I started tracking what the government was doing and what strategies were at hand. I wrote that up and published it, and then about 20 years later, I decided to revisit that question. And lo and behold, I found that Jakarta was experiencing tremendous floods, really heartbreaking. Hundreds of thousands of people losing their homes and so forth. So I started investigating what has been happening in the period in between. So this is my story about trying to explain that. So first of all, just as a general statement, urban floods are increasing throughout Southeast Asia. And one of the primary aspects of that is global climate change, which I'll talk about a bit more. Perhaps you cannot see this chart, but in terms of all of the natural disasters, quote unquote natural, that we can list, flooding turns out to be the most prevalent and the most costly. And this chart on your right-hand side shows you that in the early 1960s or so, the imputed costs of this were rather minor compared to what we're experiencing today. The impacts and the economic costs of flooding are tremendous and getting exponentially more so. One of the explanations of this phenomenon is the coastal shift of population. In virtually every country, urbanization is occurring principally along coastal areas. And these are the most susceptible to flooding, either from tidal flooding or from downstream flooding from rains and overflow dikes and so forth. Just as an example, before I get to Jakarta, we find, for example, it's very similar in many ways to the relationship between Jakarta and Bandung. These are two magnets that cannot be kept apart. And we see a lot of the issue in the Jakarta area is related to its connection to Bandung, which I'll explain. But here we have Ho Chi Minh City, which now is officially about 9 million people, and Kanto, which is a city, I think around 3 million, right across the Mekong Delta. And this is going to get it from both directions. The damming of rivers and then the overflow from that all the way down the Mekong River basin, starting from the Himalayas going through China and down through Southeast Asia. And then sea rise. So you can see in a way this kind of conundrum that urbanization, once it starts, it has this gravity to it that is very hard to counter. You can do so many efforts and nothing stops these connections from happening. I think this is one of the more riskier places in Southeast Asia to be watching in terms of flooding. All right, 2007 is now noted as the worst flood to have occurred in Jakarta. It covered 70% of the city, claimed at least 80 lives, and left 500,000 people without homes. But it has come every year since then as well. So this signals that for this last decade and from this decade forth, this is a chronic annual problem. It's a problem that is so immense that government has to have a multi-stranded approach to it. Okay, so what are the culprits? What are the sources of the flooding that's now occurring? One, the obvious one is the topography itself. 40% of Jakarta is actually below sea level, so it's polders and dikes that are holding it together in many ways. Secondly, the infrastructure itself is very old. Most of it was put into place at best in the 1960s and hasn't been improved very much since. Then we have global climate change, which is both in terms of sea rise, but also in terms of extreme weather events. So the rain that's happening is larger and more powerful than before. Next, inadequate systems of monitoring rivers and canal overflows. There's no predictive capacity until very recently. And then uncontrolled settlements, poor people coming into the city, they always go to public land where they can settle without much interference. And so you find settlements going along the canals and rivers in Jakarta, which clog them with all kinds of waste and so forth. Weak, unevenly applied, I'm being generous here, unevenly applied land use controls. Many things can be finessed. There are regulations, but not very well enforced or, as I say, unevenly enforced. And finally, absence of a coordinated spatial planning in an era of accelerated urban population, expansion, and mega projects. So I'm focusing on that last question mostly. Can we have a region-wide plan that directs the city to expand in a more environmentally sound way? So when I'm looking at it from this perspective, I see the policy question as an overlay of geographies, if you like. One is the physical geography and the population dynamics, which are very specific in moments in time, and I'll talk about that. This creates this environmental risk together with one outcome can be zoning, for example, which I'll talk about. Overlay with the built environment, and then spatial plans. So I see these as investigating different layers of analysis. So let's start with Jakarta. Jakarta has changed a lot, obviously, from the Batavia days. But what I want to focus on here is its primary or principal era of growth was really from the late 70s up to the present. And for much of the colonial experience, it stayed relatively small, same size. If you look at these different points, what I'm trying to talk about is the way globalization in its different elements locks into a society. So during the colonial era, for example, Indonesia was simply exporting raw materials or agricultural products. When in the 1960s, the first round of NIDL, or the New International Division of Labor, which is actually the redeployment of manufacturing from the West to so-called developing countries, Indonesia does not lock onto that right away. Instead, it's Korea, Taiwan, Singapore, and Hong Kong. So this is a bit delayed in the case of Indonesia, and the reasons are principally because of the plenitude of oil exports, timber, and outer island cash crops that did not necessitate a new kind of economic push. So it's only until the early 1980s when the commodity exports from the outer islands and oil is found to be finite, that there's a policy change under Suharto to open the economy to export-oriented manufacturing. And this is a real takeoff in the growth of Jakarta, because then people migrate to the city for jobs in factories along certain corridors in the city. But this does not really stay as the only linkage or the only new linkage very long, because by the mid-1980s we have a new era of mega projects, of global neoliberal policies that are privatizing and opening economies further, not only for production, but for vast investments in land. This is occurring at the same time that the Japanese bubble economy is spilling out and into the rest of Asia, creating huge push on land development. So we see not only manufacturing coming to Indonesia, but from the mid-1980s, we see a new era of mega projects coming. And then finally, the opening to finance capital, which makes global finance capital, which makes it possible to have projects that were once only millions of dollars in size can now be billions of dollars. So this is from the research I was doing with Gavin Jones, I don't know if Gavin's here today, showing you how Jakarta really starts accelerating in the 1980s, and even though it was growing quite substantially before then. And it's all during this era in which you have manufacturing exports and mega projects and global finance capital coming into real estate ventures. Now, interestingly, if we look at the 1960s and 70s, the landscape changes we see through the connections with globalization are mostly peripheral to the city. They're in export processing, or in the case of Indonesia, ports and road and arterial transportation system. But if those of you who know Jakarta in the 1970s, it really didn't change all that much until the 1980s. And it was hard to find a big hotel in the early 1970s in Jakarta. Now there are plenty. We can talk about that too. So this is what I'm talking about. Suddenly in the 1980s, around 1985 is the year I use, because that's when Endaka, or the revaluation of the yen against the U.S. currency, creates this huge bubble economy coming out of Japan and spilling through East and Southeast Asia and Hawaii. And we see suddenly the appearance of elements in the built environment we had not seen before throughout Asia, but in Jakarta too. Private new towns, mega malls, global franchise. I think the first McDonald's opened in Jakarta in 1984. That's a good indicator, right? When did the first McDonald's open? Tall buildings, hub airports, and tourism and so forth. All of these things come in a very, very short period, very condensed and very large. Okay? So this is the region we're talking about. We can always have fun in Indonesia with words for large regions. It used to be Jabotabek, but as it gets bigger, you hive off a kabupaten name, so then it became Jabodetabek for Depok, and now it's Jabodetabek Punjur. Not long, because as it gets bigger, the name gets longer. So there's Jakarta, and you can see the topography. The connection used to be through, main connection used to be through Bogor to Puncak to Bandung. And it's that connection that's drawing a lot of the increase in population settlement. And this is the growth. You can see it's already spilling into what we are calling the black, or the dark black in the center would be the core, and then the inner zone, and then outer zone. In our research we did for the book we put together on mega-urban regions in Asia, Gavin Jones and I, this was the study we did, and this shows you the core, the inner zone and outer zone by non-agricultural employment density, and we had a whole methodology for this. The main point of this is that by the 1990s, the core had essentially stopped growing in terms of population, and the middle class was moving out to the inner zone, to these really fancy new Kota Wisata, Kota Legenda, all of these fancy private new towns. The core, to the extent that it was growing, was actually through migration, through low-income people. So you had almost like a Chicago ecology phenomenon, that the poor people moved to the city center and the middle class moves to the suburbs. And that's the kind of pattern that started to develop during the 1990s in particular. So what's happening in the core is globalizing in the sense that now you have grand projects for the Jakarta's Golden Triangle on Jalan Kuningan of high-rise business offices and a number of poles along the way to the new airport, but basically sprawl out to the inner zone. Shopping malls appear in incredible numbers. I just read that over the last decade, something like 3.5 million square meters of shopping malls have been built in Jakarta alone, which is more than twice the amount from 1960 to that point, to 2000. So even now, in this current decade, there's this tremendous coverage of land by shopping malls and business tall buildings. Something that happened after 1998, which is after the overthrow of Suharto, the regulation, or the trying to control the small shop owners, the so-called informal sector, basically was put aside. And so you see also part of the phenomenon now in Jakarta is lower income people coming in, and the shops just keep going right out into the street. And that is further clogging up all kinds of drainage and byways. Okay, so this is trying to tell you that in the 1980s and 90s there was this great new burst of new towns. Most of them private, in fact all of them private, and most of them gated so that only the residents or their friends could get in. This comes at a moment of neoliberal policies that are deregulating the city, are allowing for the privatization of space. And so you find not only is the banking system deregulated to allow for very large amounts of capital to come in, but everything is simplified and made easier for investment to come in to the country and to the city. So if we look at this new housing, you can see that in the inner zone, in that 1, 2, 3, third kind of area there before the bottom, housing is starting to appear in this zone that is environmentally very, very risky in terms of it's an aquifer for the region, a lot of tree coverage that's important to stop the flooding of the city. So these are the kinds of stresses that are very classic. Jakarta's got them all. On one hand, you have most of the residents of the city prefer to just have their own wells, and that has almost depleted the groundwater to the extent that Jakarta is subsiding. It is actually sinking. And some buildings, I'm told, are listing. But the water that you now draw from wells, I think at least up to Menteng, is salty now. You cannot really drink it. So that's happening from the sea side. And then the deforestation, the covering over the aquifers is having the impact of not holding the water when it rains. So all of these are happening. We can see example of tidal floods. 24,000 hectares of floodplains in North Jakarta have now been turned into residential industrial areas. So once thoroughly covered with mangroves, now pretty much eliminated by settlement. And that, in turn, is allowing, when the tide is very high, flooding comes into the north. There's some estimates by the World Bank, if you put them all together. Sea level rise expected over from 2007 to 2025, that you'll have a total of about 100, maybe 120, 130 centimeters of rise in terms of flooding. Or sinking, if you put it the other way around. This shows you how it's really interesting how compact the city was actually in 1992, and how it really expanded over the next decade to reach right into the southern part toward Bogor. That outline that you see is Jabodetabek. That's the larger Jakarta mega-urban region. In the 1960s, about 30% of the area was covered with green space. That's now said to be about 9%. So there's a drastic reduction of the coverage of area by open spaces. This is the great irony of all this, is that Jakarta gets the brunt of the floods, even when development's happening far away. And one of the biggest problems to discuss is that Jakarta is a government and West Java is another government. And they often are at loggerheads with each other about who to blame and who should do what. It's one of the great problems in this whole region, is who should have responsibility for the disastrous development in the West Java part that is causing flooding or contributing to flooding in Jakarta. Okay, so in the late 70s, early 1980s, the Department of Public Works, or the Cipta Karya, came up with a plan that it was going to try to encourage the development of Jakarta in a Jakarta-out fashion, to keep it in a zone of urbanization that they thought was most suitable. It should not go north to the mangroves in this coast, and it should not go south to the high toward Bogor and to the Puncak toward Bandung. And I got very interested in this, what it's all about. And I was reminded today that it was called the guided land policy, which meant it had all carrots and no sticks. It was going to use infrastructure, basically a new airport in Tangerang, and then industrial zones over in Bekasi, and arterial roads to create this infrastructure. But it wasn't capable and did not include in it any punishment or any regulation for development elsewhere. So in a situation of accelerated urbanization, when the population is increasing dramatically, this simply will not work in most cases. But this is before Jakarta really starts to take off for export-oriented manufacturing. So in the short term, it actually worked, I would argue, because the migration wasn't yet very strong. A company was hired by Public Works to develop this kind of map, in which they say, you know, in certain zones you should allow this, in certain zones you shouldn't. And if you see, Zone 3 is basically where the urbanization should be contained, according to this. And this map sat around for a long time, but it was never adopted officially. It was never part of any law. And this is a phenomenon of all countries in the world, but particularly in Indonesia, is you'll have one bureau put a wonderful idea together, and the others will simply ignore it. So the Ministry of Industry had its plan, Ministry of Agriculture has its plan, and this one goes on. Interestingly enough, it's still alive. I found this in the recent plan of Jakarta for 2020, has this as its zoning map. So it does have a life in some ways. Here's a surprise, though. I started looking at spatial strategies after the 1980s. And basically, you can see the old Jakarta out is still there. But in my provocative way of saying it, Jakarta caved in. It gave up. Because you see now it's allowing the north-south development. It's acknowledging that this is happening, and instead of trying to resist it, it's accommodating it. The problem with this kind of map, by the way, is someone was asking, did I consider density? It really doesn't take account of how much activity in that Zone 3 can be sustained, because it's true that a lot of development has occurred in that zone, but it's incredible, the amount. The land cover and the destruction of open spaces and so forth is really too intensive for that zone. So even if you had this map, it's still not quite good enough to look in detail of what you should be doing. So we get to the 2007 flood, and you can see, I wish I had a film I was going to show you of that, just to bring that to you. It really was horrible. It's disease and loss of livelihood and housing and on and on. And then it's happening in 2008, 2009, and 2010. But what is being done? So here's what I'm saying, is the contributions and limitations of treating flooding as a water sector problem. This is a classic kind of statement I'm making, the difference between spatial planning and sector planning. Most of development planning is still sectors, and they're like silos. They plan all by themselves to study and resolve their issues by themselves. So I think there can be a lot achieved if you treat water as a sector, but it's very limited. It tends to be ameliorative. So here's what they are doing now in Jakarta as I understand it. First of all, modeling the rivers and trying to predict, if it rains so much, which rivers are going to overflow and how much flooding will occur. Apparently, most of the major waterways now have this in place, and so there is some greater capacity to predict, to warn people that this kind of event is coming. There's also dredging of waterways going on, reinforcing dams, construction of new drainage canals, and then there have whole kinds of disaster management programs for evacuation assistance and shelters. So I think this is all to the good, but it doesn't address most of the problems. And the major problem of intensive land cover by mega projects and other kinds of developments in the city region that are really out of control in terms of the environment. So I think there are two levels worth talking about. One is, what do you do at the community level, neighborhood and community, or smaller spatial scale? One of the great issues, and if just in mentioning it you already realize what a tremendous task it is to think about flood control when you talk about housing. Because a lot of the worst aspects of this is if you live along the canals, and there's huge numbers of people in Jakarta that indeed live along the canals. So what I would take this further and say that when you start considering all the things that need to be done, you immediately get into issues of social justice, environmental justice, the inequality of the city. You get into issues of private towns that do not allow anyone except the very rich into them, taking over agricultural land. So you really get into a huge area of critical dialogue if you want to, but it's rarely posed that way. Rarely posed that way. Anyway, these are some of the things that need to be done. It's my view that you cannot have people living on the canals, actually. It's just not possible in this age of frequent annual flooding. It's going to be devastating. Then the question is, where will these people be? That's a huge issue that I can't get into here. Stopping groundwater extraction. Industries are extracting groundwater at very, very high rates, as households are too, because the city water supply isn't that reliable, or indeed it's cheaper just to dig down and pump it out. Solid waste management needs improvement. A lot of improvement in the water and other kinds of infrastructure like roads and so forth. Much of the drainage system, for example, also has cables in it, right? It's always convenient to put the electrical supply and the internet cables right in the same channel. So those need separation. A lot of work in those areas. But returning to my larger interest, can there be a way to spatially, to look at this at a larger city region scale and take a strategy that will deal with that? It would take something like this. You'd have to have some kind of zoning in which you will have regulation. For example, if you have a zone that says this is forest, no deforestation, then you have to enforce it. Otherwise, it's just another pretty picture, which has been going on for some time. You need region-wide water catchment areas and recapturing green space strategically throughout the region. The Jakarta government is very proud that it has converted 27 gas stations into green areas, and that's a plus, but it's certainly just a modest contribution, because at the same time it's apparently giving a lot of green spaces over to private development. And recent newspaper reports suggest that the green space is actually still decreasing in Jakarta itself. Then I think finally we're going to have to get Bandung and Jakarta together. This region is getting very, very big in its impact, environmental relationships. Now we've got at least Punjur, which is Punjak and Cianjur, right? We're getting closer to Bandung in this name. But finally it's a dual metropolitan region that needs a planning. And here's what, in fact, is one of the incarnations of the spatial planning. This is done, I believe, a couple of years ago, extended out to 2020. And in this map, you can see a number of growth poles, growth centers, to try to contain the urban development into centers, and then very much like that environmental map to try to contain the expansion of the city in certain places. Well, at the same time, Jakarta's now planning its own spatial plan that has little to do with this. And it's a great controversy. I invite you to look through newspaper articles on it. You'll see that among the debates is how much green space is actually going to be provided, whether the governor's really doing the right thing, where's the citizen participation, and on it goes. But the main point I'd like to conclude with is that these plans have very little official status. They're put out, they seem to be robust, and they seem to be quite compelling in their ideas in many ways, but the actual implementation remains very, very far away. So on one hand, we have at least the sensibility that this is needed. On the other hand, governance hasn't quite come to terms with it in terms of actual implementation. So beyond the storm, beyond talking about water, I think what we really need to talk about is a region-wide development strategy. In that blue map, I note that the purpose of that is to tell you that Jakarta, or Jabodetabek Punjur, is now absorbing most of the urban population growth of Java. It is now, in 2000, we estimated it was about 21 million. I heard recently it's at 26 million, and soon it will be 30 or 40 million in population. This is not only just a place for the habitat of those people, it's also, as some of our friends said, an economic engine for the whole country. So, whether Jakarta, whether Java at least. And so we need to pay attention to its governance in a broader perspective than just water. It's a vast, vast urban region, as that last photo says. And for our discussion, what I just would like to repeat again, that it's more than simply water, and it's more than simply economics. It's all also about social justice, the right to the city, and so many other aspects that we could talk about. I asked all of my friends from Indonesia around that I know here, and I won't talk about Abidin because he's going to give a discussion, but there's a certain pessimism that much can be done about this. Much will be done. It's now chronic. It's going to happen every year, and it's huge, the flooding. So it's going to take really tremendous efforts to keep this, to reverse this. I think that some of the water sector stuff is doing some contribution, but it's simply not at the pace of the problem itself. So I hope that more concentrated commitments can come toward these kinds of issues, but at the moment it's pretty drastic. And on that note, I open up for discussion. Thank you.
I summarize some of the important takeaways from this presentation. You certainly brought about the centrality of addressing water, because while many of these cities don't have water for their citizens, they're getting flooded, so they need to manage water. The second one that you highlighted is that their urbanization trends kind of unstoppable because they are the engines of growth. So they do happen whether the policymakers do plan for it or do not. And the third and the most important one that you brought about, which we actually talk about in our Developing Living Cities book, is that there's also the contrast to the living cities, is cities that choke. Because if they don't turn the development of the nation and the economic growth that the nation is getting because of the urbanization of the cities into real infrastructure development in the cities, they can just become choked cities. In a sense, all of the wealth that has been created may well be lost if the cities are not able to cope for it. I won't ask you to respond to that right away, but let's invite a few questions before I give it to Professor Abidin Kusno to make his opening responses and comments to stir up the discussions. Maybe a couple of questions from the floor which we will collect for Professor Douglas. We can think about it while we have Professor Kusno make some comments.
The pace of urbanization, I think we need to look into the pace of urbanization and the sectors, because if you talk about sectors planning, spatial strategy, spatial planning, you compare between the two. But I think there's something lack in between is the time given for the allocation, the time and the space allocation for the development. Okay, maybe into your economic progression, whether what are the sectors of industry that you are going to do into that for the time frame into the next 10 years or 20 years. Because if the pace of this development and this spatial planning and the sector planning, if it doesn't match, I think it's difficult for you to do any strategic planning. So the time given to identify which industry you are going into and the usage of the resources, you are using how much of the water resources, how much exploitation, that deforestation, this requires long-term planning. If there's no balance between these three factors I mentioned, the spatial planning, sector planning, and the industrialization with the time frame given for your future development, I think it's difficult for us to keep accurate strategies or forecast planning into, okay, how much deforestation can be done, and in order to give way to industrialization or urbanization development? Thanks.
Hi, I'm Johannes from Architecture. Jakarta is hopeless. Since old Batavia, the Governor General tried to move Dandos, for example, from the old Batavia to Lapangan Banteng. Then from Lapangan Banteng, they're dreaming to move to Bogor. And then from Bogor, they want to move to Bandung. So from history, we know that people try to escape from Jakarta. How about the idea to move the national capital to Jonggol or even to Makassar?
Mike, the question you raise about city expansion in an environmentally sound way is a very important question. But as you went along in your presentation, it got progressively dimmer and dimmer in terms of prospects. So my question is very simple. I mean, if you look at Jakarta, Greater Jakarta, is there any hope? I mean, just say something that is hopeful. Thank you.
So those are three challenging questions for Mike, and maybe to further provoke the conversation, let's have Professor Abidin.
Thank you. It is certainly not my job to add more knowledge. I think my task here is to open up, more issues in a way that would allow some conversation to go on. I think before, actually, Casey has already come up with an agenda to talk about hope rather than to talk about the hopelessness of Jakarta that Johannes actually tried to tease out. But I would actually like to go back to Johannes' important point as well. But one of the things that I think is fascinating about Mike's talk is that he didn't start with Jakarta. Yeah, he started with other places, Ho Chi Minh City. In some ways, he's trying to come up with a sense that we simply cannot analyze Jakarta by separating Jakarta from other parts of the world. It's not even just the region. So in some way, it is inadequate for us to keep talking about Jakarta without having a sense of the scale of the issue here. So that is the first point. The second point is that he kept emphasizing 1980s. He called this a turning point in the whole way of thinking about development. And in some ways, that sort of a way of thinking, demand a particular constructions or restructuring of urban space. And that's why one of the keywords that he uses is he emphasized on land. He talked about ecology and then so on and so forth. But in the end, he actually emphasizing on land. And land is always social and political. In other words, after 1980s, for Mike, what is important now is to focusing on the way in which development really demands space to endlessly expanding. And then that is where the problem begins. And again, this is not just about Jakarta. This is in fact a phenomenon that is going on in other parts of Southeast Asia. And therefore, he's using a larger scale of analysis, what he called globalization. And I'm pleased by the fact that he actually used the word neoliberalism. It's a particular kind of globalization that has this emphasis on endless economic growth as a measurement of the success of the city. And he's quite despaired by the fact that if once you have that kind of a new ideology in 1980s, gone is the idea that the state, including planners, can play a major role in urban development. So there's a kind of a sense, where is the planning now? The planning seems to have gone. So he's actually trying to ask us to come up with a debate on a larger issue, on the fact that the restructuring of the world economic growth demand Jakarta and other parts of Southeast Asian cities to reconfigure the space in such a way that they are encountering a lot of a series of problems beyond the management, beyond the scope of the planning, beyond the scope of the state intervention. So I think we need to have a conversation on that before we later on go into all kind of a practical, solution. And then out of that, maybe some kind of a hope, could be discussed as well. But there's an invitation for us to reconceptualize the way we understand city. How are we going to escape from the idea of endless economic growth as a way to talk about livable city? So with that, I think we can open for more discussion.
Thank you for that. That was, you made important points to look at, first of all, beyond Jakarta, then look at beyond just city as a physical space, and then you asked for hope. Let's hope that at the end of the conversation we will have some hopeful points and hope for Jakarta and the region as a whole. Before I ask Mike to respond, I'm suggesting to the audience to please prepare your next round of questions so that we will be going seamlessly with lively debate and discussion. So Mike, please.
Thank you very much. Well, about economic forecasting, I think if you were to look back over the last 20 years, you wouldn't have done well. We're not in a time when you can have a 10 or 20-year projection of your economy anymore. The world is too turbulent. So I think we should be looking more at economic resilience. How do you bounce back from crises? Having said that, one element I didn't bring out very much is that Jakarta is no longer really a city of production. It's a city of consumption. Its production has been peripheralized to some extent. It still has the factories and all that. But what's driving the redevelopment of the core and the suburbs is really consumer buying of housing, of advanced services, shopping malls. And so we have to start talking about the city of consumption, not city of material production as such, and put them together. Capital ectomies, they don't work. Seoul is trying that. It's moving some of its functions about 1 hour away, and what's going to happen is the people will live in Seoul and commute to this new place. It's well known. There are many experiences, Tanzania, Brazil, they've all done this, but it doesn't stop the growth of those huge agglomerations. They have a agglomeration power unto themselves. At the same time, as Tokyo found out when they started thinking about moving the capital city functions out of Tokyo, the Ministry of Finance said, not us. The powerful ministries are not going to move. Because what is missing from this understanding is that there are lifestyles too. There's the hospital, the university, the schools for the kids. They're all in Jakarta. Or take any other country in Asia. They're all in the capital city or the big cities. It's even more powerful in places like Korea and Japan, where the capital city has this cultural value that is so high, it is better to be sleeping in school in Seoul than studying in the countryside. This is the attitude. So I don't think moving the capital city functions really works to any significant extent. Hope. Thank you, Casey. If you remember my presentation on Globopolis and all that, I see two major trends occurring in Asia and many other places. One is this aggressive capital that's coming in and doing what I was talking about. But the other is the rise of civil society. And information. Globalization also brings in new forms of information and knowledge that, in the case, for example, the overthrow of Suharto was partly done through the internet, by news of Suharto's wealth that was first published coming through internet. So there is that happening. If you were to follow what's going on in Jakarta now with the new spatial plan, there's all kinds of citizen involvement now. NGOs are organizing, and it's not simply resistance. They're actually offering alternatives. The problem in all that is the government hasn't taken that step to recognize them more fully. Now, NGOs have a dark side to them too, so I don't want to be too romantic about this, but I think the source of it is going to be accountability. And I think 1998 is hugely important, obviously, for Indonesia. It opened the possibility of citizens taking charge of government for the first time. And so that's where my hope is.
I'm John Chen from National Huaqiao University in China. It seems to me that the city expanding is just inevitable. So we can find the same problem in Beijing or Shanghai or Guangzhou as elsewhere in China. So if city expanding is just inevitable and there should be an ideal model that we can follow. And I think we get 2 experts and maybe 3. And from your observation or research, which do you think is the best model? Can you make some example in terms of city expanding in the world? And also, there is some suggestions like relocation of the capital city, or maybe building some satellite towns. So is it a good solution to this problem? And also, I attend the speech of Abidin this morning. When you made the speech, you present a map of the world, talking about world cities, and I have noticed that you didn't include Shanghai or Beijing in mainland China. You just include Hong Kong and Macau. So, do you think that Beijing or Shanghai is not a world city, or if you have something on this to share with us? Okay.
My name is Sanja, and I'm from GAI. My expertise in economics, but my understanding in geography is not very good. Well, this is a question which I just wanted to ask. Basically, if you look at the economic development and the urbanization process, we see that we can't compromise with these mega projects, because as the urbanization process go on, mega projects are inevitable. So where exactly is the trade-off? I mean, what kind of planning is actually do you really think of, so that we won't actually plunge into that kind of problem that we're talking about right now? Thank you.
Hi, I'm Rita. I'm from the Global Asia Institute as well as Digital Water Policy at the Lee Kuan Yew School. Thank you, Mike, for your presentation, and I'm glad that you mentioned, you highlight the importance of citizen participation in having some hope to Jakarta. I'm just wondering, in your experience so far, can you tell us any example of citizen participation that really makes a difference in terms of the way that the city is developing, that maybe Jakarta can be inspired of? Thanks.
All right. Okay. Let me respond first to these issues of urbanization, of city expanding as a kind of an inevitable sort of a process. Okay, if we accept that kind of a movement, the continuing expansions of city outward, what is important to remember is that there's a process in which city is expanding, but there's no urbanization. Now, what does that mean? You have city expanding, but there's no urbanization. The term urbanization is a very specific process. That means that you, in fact, create a class of people who are able, in fact, to survive in the city, whose work will be acknowledged, formally by the city government. And therefore, they can become what we call the citizen of the city. Now, if that is what we mean by urbanization, then I don't think, we have a real process of urbanization. We may have city expanding without urbanization. There's only city expanding with, not really with mode of production or consumption. In fact, it's all mode of exploitation that we are getting. So that is just one note here. And your question about world city, I think we need to put a bit of a context, because I was actually, almost like preaching before I came here in the morning for the RE sort of an issue. The map that I used was actually an old map that came out from John Friedman and another fellow who come up with this this thesis of world city formation, and that was actually came from was it late 80s maybe?
Early 80s, and actually it's based on airlines.
Based on airlines, So at that time, Shanghai, I was actually not really trying to show the real map of the world today, but was trying to come up with this point that the world city formation, it was formulated by what we call sort of a quite quote-unquote radical, critical scholars on urbanization basically try to show critically the idea of world cities competing with each other to be on the map. But that kind of a paradigm, quite strangely, has been very much welcomed by what we call policy makers or entrepreneurial class, somehow taking it out of context by just trying to get the city, onto the map. Now that is in fact also taking place in 1980s. So Mike is right to say that 1980s was a turning point, not only in terms of the reality, the practices of urbanization, but in terms of conceptual framework for intellectuals to understand the process of urbanization. Before then, there was what we call in urban studies, the study of collective consumption. The idea that the capital and the labor could be more or less stabilized by the state as well as planners by taking care of collective consumption, meaning the infrastructure, the healthcare, education, and so on and so forth. And if any citizen doesn't get that, then you can constitute what we call urban social movement. And that paradigm was very powerful, in 60s and 70s. And partly because of 1980s, there was a major restructuring of capitalism that allow all those what we call factories to move to our region. And that really create a big problems for analysts, the radical analysts in the West, because they lost that kind of a component. If the state and the planners are no longer functioning, if the whole strategy of development is now based upon the cooperation between the private and the public sector, if there's a withdrawal of the state from the role of urban planning, then gone is the idea of collective consumption, and gone is the idea of urban social movement, because you can't ask for some kind of you can't protest anymore. To whom you will be protesting? Who would you be working for, right? So there's a major interest to begin to look at our side of the world, Southeast Asia, in 80s and 90s, just to try to trace, what happened with the social urban movement there. If all the workers now are outside, are now in our region, there should be something called, the collective consumption issues, the urban social movement issues. But unfortunately, this kind of a framework has not been taken up locally by our regional intellectuals. And what is also quite interesting is that before this kind of mode of analyze get a ground in our region, these theories in the West set up this paradigm called the world city formation. Somehow, because they feel that we can't analyze, we can't use our old framework anymore. We have to use a different framework, and so they set up this world city formation. And in some way, in a very strange way, that kind of a paradigm has been more or less appropriated by a kind of a more developmentalist, framework, and therefore reduce the kind of the critical analysis of what it was intended to be. So anyway, I'm just taking the opportunity of giving another layer to you on these issues of world city. Yeah.
Okay. Well, first of all, if I were in China, I would be saying the same thing you would, right? But it's not true. In fact, recent data shows half the cities in the world are shrinking, declining in population. So it's a very myopic view that urbanization is inevitable and all cities are going to grow. In fact, it's both time-specific and uneven at any one moment. So we find, for example, the whole shift of East Asia from Korea and Japan to China is leading in Korea to shrinking of medium-sized cities. Right now, Tokyo is shrinking. The suburbs of Tokyo are actually depopulating. So, just as a straightforward answer, it's not true. However, we can still look for models. And so we find these handful of models that are always presented to us, like Curitiba in Brazil is always put forth. Now, what is the magic of that? is that they could integrate land use, transportation, and urban design. And they could do that through regulatory powers. Most cities in the world can't do this. Most cities, unless they have very, very strong governments, but then the governments tend to be so strong that they suffocate a lot of civil society, which is my argument against the mainstream livability kinds of constructs that are always material. They never consider culture, public space, daily life. It's always economy, whatnot. So I would invite people who talk about livable cities to start to consider the daily social and cultural and even spiritual life of people as a main ingredient in livable cities. There are plenty of cities that are, one could put Portland, Oregon, is always put forth as a livable city because of the kind of amalgam of population, civil society, moving to Oregon, wanting that life, and putting those demands on government. Do I know of any city practices in which they're successful? Many, many. The tendency, though, is that they remain small scale. And the problem is they can't get government to get involved. If you want to scale up from a successful community reinvigorment or redevelopment, finally government has to come in, because then you need a program that goes across the city. In that regard, we have some reported successes. For example, the Kampung Improvement Program, in its own way, was very successful. And we have the Orangi Pilot Project in Pakistan. So we can point to many of them. There's no perfect answer, but finally, it's really local. Singapore is not Jakarta, right? It's the amalgam of civil society government that determines what we're talking about. And so I've always argued that we don't have a third world or developing countries. We have global local. And the locality, the constellation of power in the locality matters. So that turns our whole way of understanding the world to more contextual. We have to understand context. And then we get into the real details of Jakarta, for example. So I presented a macro view that kind of broad brush strokes indicated what I think is happening in the world and in this part of the world in particular. But it doesn't tell you the story right down on the ground.
Hello, my name is Mette Christine Østrup, and we have a summit in October called Chi Global, where we bring thought leaders together to talk about sustainable innovation. And one of the speakers, one of the local speakers, will be an architect called Tae Kang Sun, who has developed this theory called urbanization, where you basically take the best of the urban life and brings it into the countryside. Do you know of any, maybe not models, but real examples of these kind of Rubens, where people like us want to move back to the countryside, and especially also all the poor people would maybe not go to places like Jakarta, but rather stay where they are? Thank you.
Thank you. Wendy from the National Parks Board. Basically, I'd like to hear some comments from the two professors regarding the role or contribution of subnational government, city officials, because we are talking about cities, and what is their, what is their role in addressing these challenges vis-a-vis the role of national governments? Thank you.
I'd be interested to know about any scales of measurement or like any factors, whether it's population figures or the infrastructure. Is it over-exploitation of the resources? Because earlier Professor Douglas mentioned that Jakarta has turned into a city of consumption, not production, city of production. So what is the factors that you look for to determine whether this city is already a city of consumption? Is it an irreversible process? Once you reach a stage into a city of consumption, it won't be reversed back. There's no way for you to reverse back to a city of production. Is that only one way, unidirectional? Whether such a city can be turned into a city of production and consumption as well. Is that a possibility? Because earlier one of the audience brought out that Jakarta is a city beyond hope. So I think I'd be interested to know whether this is a reversible or irreversible process, and what are the factors that determine that city already reached a stage labeled as city of consumption, no more production? Thanks.
Well, the idea of urbanization is very old. In fact, if you go back to the origins of Western urban regional planning, it's Ebenezer Howard and Garden Cities. It was always to get the best of the rural and the best of the urban together. Now, history has shown, though, that that becomes a rather bourgeois proposition. It becomes fancy communities for very rich people, if you look at the real experiences in England and elsewhere. And that's my main comment on all the good environmental stuff is it's often used as an excuse to ignore inequality, to ignore the plight of poor people. You have in China, for example, this vast expansion of gated new towns that are zero carbon footprint, but therefore they're rich and they're gated. And that's nowhere on the agenda. So my question back to you would be, how are you going to be inclusive? How are you going to reach all of society with these grand schemes without gentrifying the countryside in some fashion that the garden cities have done? Of course, local government is crucial. It has to be part of this. You cannot run or manage a city from the center. Having said that, who's going to take care of the caretaker's daughter while the caretaker's busy taking care? In other words, you have local governments that are very, very bad. And many times it's the central government that has to kind of enforce something. So it goes back and forth. But indeed, one of the greatest experiments now happening in Asia now is Indonesia. The really radical decentralization. It's like a moving target. We cannot just analyze it today and say that's it. We're going to have to wait another 10 or 15 years to see how that works out. But there are a lot of actually very positive things happening through the decentralization. In other countries like Japan, for example, I'm doing a lot of research on the globalization of the household and on foreign migrant workers. It's the local governments that are more, in Japan, are more supportive of migrants than the national government, because they have to deal with them every day. They see them in many ways as human beings. So there are all kinds of ways that the center and local have to both coexist, but each has a different relationship, and they're both important. What else did I miss?
Consumption.
I'm not saying consumption is bad, so don't put it that way. But what's happening in many Western countries, including the United States, is it's now going into what can be called, is called by some people, an experience economy. You're buying experiences. When you go to Starbucks, yeah, there's coffee there, but you're buying the Starbucks experience. You're buying, you go to a sports game, you're buying your favorite team's experience. You're consuming experiences, nothing palpable. And China is taking over the role of producing everything else in the world and sending it to the United States. So it's not as if you're not producing something, it's just that you're not producing something material. You're producing a service or an experience. And that's possible because you have, throughout this industrialization period, the emergence of a very large middle class. And that's all to the good, I think, in generally. And you want this to happen with urbanization, that a large middle class does appear and engages in consumption. So I don't see that as a negative feature. It gets problematic about when you have crises and you're not growing food for yourself anymore, or you can't, all of those relationships. But in and of itself, consumption, not
self-sufficient. Because if they say a city of consumption, it creates an idea to me that if you don't no longer a city of production, that means you couldn't self-supply your own needs. You only can rely on external source of supply.
But cities have always done that. For example, the definition of cities, we don't produce food. So from the get-go, from the origin of cities themselves, they were always dependent on another place to keep them going.
Is this a sign of significance that natural resources in Jakarta or certain parts of Indonesia has been overexploited? Is that one of the significance?
That's another subject altogether, but it's certainly clear in Jambot Dedabek Punjur that technically irrigated agriculture is disappearing. Vital, really very, very productive agricultural land is really disappearing. But
what I want to add on these issues of consumption is more, people are able to consume because they have income, right? So there's this level of issues of wage as well. What kind of a consumption? And I guess the interesting issues behind this is that if you want to raise the level of consumption, what this means is that you have to raise the wages, of not just the middle class, but also the working class. Now, if you raise the wage of the working class, then that would have some consequences in terms of, how much profit, if you are an entrepreneur, capitalist class. So all these things would have to be taken into consideration. So I guess I'm just adding on this. But I do want to respond on these issues of whether one could in fact move people back to the countryside. I think the case of China is really quite, in some way, quite fascinating. And I don't think this is a new movement, but there's increasing an important movement among Chinese intellectuals to begin to more or less trying to de-emphasize the idea of growth in Chinese economy, but more on what we call equality. Now, this is a minority group. The growth camp has been quite dominant, but there's a relatively influential but small camp who try to come up with this project. They call this the new rural reconstruction. The idea is to allow peasants/workers, to more or less have a space in the rural, and therefore there's a way to control urbanization. And in China, the politics of urbanization is quite peculiar because they have that hukou system where if you were born in the countryside, then you will remain a rural person and you can't gain a citizenship in China. Now, what is important in this kind of a schema is that you could conceptualize that movement of bringing people back to the rural, to the countryside, as a form of pacifying them, in some way, so that they won't create trouble in the city. So we don't know how successful this thing can be, but we have to understand that city is amazingly attractive. The notion of whatever the positive side of modernity, youngsters, younger people would always want to experience city beyond any economic calculation. That there's something about the city that we have to discuss. Now, if we bring back to the context of Indonesia, this idea of bringing people back to the city is a fascinating idea. But Indonesia, again, has a different context. The formations of the powerful New Order Suharto regime, the whole purpose is to dismantle the so-called social political life of the rural because of the whole events of what we call, the communist working together with the peasants. And so after 1960s, there was this conscious attempt to allow the rural people to more or less move to the city in some way to stabilize the economy. And that became even more powerful in 1980s and 90s. But there was this idea of you allow people to stay in the rural, but they shouldn't have any social or political sort of affiliation. In other words, you cannot be a fully human in that sense, So this idea of returning back to the countryside thing would be fascinating to see in the context of post-Suharto era. But it's not entirely clear. There's still a fear of creating some kind of a collectivism in the rural that would trigger that whole memory of the past.
Hi, good afternoon. I'm asking in the capacity as a private citizen. I don't come from the government. I lived in Pluit for 2 years, 93 to 95. I was running in factories in Bekasi and Pulau Gadong. By the way, somebody talking about the lack of hope. I have many friends in Jakarta. Depending on who you ask, a lot of people are very hopeful down there if you have lots of money down there. It is not hopeless. It depends on who you ask there. Maybe you look at the flood and the chart, this can be something else. My question to Professor is this. You spent many years around. Is there something in your studies, your travel, for a city to have a soul, in this case I'm asking S-O-U-L, something Asianness there. Because it will be very sad to me if someday the World City Forum, you have only one model of a perfect city and losing the touch of the, I'm just wrapping up the word using the word soul to represent social, daily life, spiritual, so on and so forth. Because I have a lot of friends who came to Singapore who love to go back to Jakarta despite all the flooding with lots of hope. Something in them say about that city despite the flooding.
Hello, I'm Sujan from Architecture. Oftentimes when we enter into this debate about planning, we have a tendency to steer into either one of two spectrums, the Fordist kind of end about economic growth, mega projects, so forth, and the other end of the spectrum, which is post-Fordist, flexibility, looking at the community, ground-up initiatives. And by doing so, I think we're creating a very rigid dualism. And of course, whenever there's a dualism, there'll always be conflicting views. Is there a middle ground somewhere, to borrow the word from, the term from Edward Soja, a third space? Is there such a city that exists today that is a third space, a hybridity that manages to find compromise in terms of planning?
Yeah, Thaddeus, I want to ask you a question. Because you mentioned, in the water, they have aquifers and they have personal wells. So what they're doing is they're damaging the city by sinking it because they're draining the water supply and stuff. So I've read about in cities such as Mumbai, Manila, all these slums, they have these water problems and these infrastructure problems, so they have to resort to these personal means to actually get water for survival. So they have private vendors there who raise the price and really make their lives miserable. And how would you suggest a government to solve these problems? Because the government can't possibly build pipelines into the slums because they don't want people in the slums to begin with. So how would you suggest the government solve it?
Okay. Actually, I agree 1,000% with the sentiment you're expressing, and that's what most of my work has been this past 10 years. Is on the cultural and social life of cities. And I had last year I had a big photo contest in Hanoi, which Hanoian citizens gave their photos of what they thought is livable city. Those photos would not fall on most livable city indices. They're really about the places and the memories of the people in those cities. And so I think that's what I want to put on the agenda. You call it soul, I could call it social, cultural. We need to have that on the agenda. What's happening is that the mega projects I'm talking about are really mowing that down. They're erasing the vernacular history of cities. And they generally target the lower and less well-off neighborhoods because the land is cheap and you get a lot of profit from that. So you see from Seoul to Jakarta a marching of these projects to eliminate the history of these cities and replace it with simulated cultural things. In Jakarta suburbs, you find the Sphinx. You'll find all kinds of non-Indonesian things. And in the case of Vietnam, one developer says, we want no aspect of Vietnam in our architecture. So there's that going on. Middle ground, I think, of course there is, but I think you have to, as an architect too, you have to look at the spaces of cities. Because it's not the whole city. What we're finding now is the city that was once more inclusive is now becoming divided into segmented, privatized, gated, rich versus poor. The cities in many Asian countries are actually getting less middle ground. So my interest is also, for example, where on your livability index is public space? It's disappearing in most Asian cities very, very rapidly. And so I made a film that some of you saw on this vast park, Tongya Park in Hanoi, to show you the vitality of exactly what you're talking about. Rich, poor, old, young, can all come to these spaces. That's the third space, is the liminality, where you can negotiate with the person about whose space is this and how can we get along in this space. Those are the vital spaces, and I would invite us all to study those spaces. So it's not just an aggregate story. We have to look at the real physical spaces of cities to answer that. Was there another question?
Private water issue.
Oh, well, yes, it is a dilemma. The governments often don't want to give water services to slums because then they'll validate them. But in fact, they do. So if you look at Bangkok, the slums have water and so forth. So it's not as black and white as you seem to suggest. But what a slum is a slum to me because of the environment. It's not about income so much. And so really it's an environmental task. It's a very selective one, I think, as I said. Along canals, we really have to say we have to move people away from there. But in other places, you can regularize those communities. You can help them with site and service projects. And they are happening. They're just not at the scale in some countries that they ought to be.
Yes, I'm fully with you about the Jakarta thing strongly. This idea of soul and the strange thing about Jakarta. I mean, this is not just about feeling. In a very strange way, Jakarta, from the past, Johannes could actually inform us even more. It has always been what we call unplanned city, you know. And in some ways, it is unplanned that you could consider it as a planned city. It's purposeful in a very strange way to make it unplanned, you know. And it has, you can go back to the colonial issues, the fact that from the economic point of view, it's not feasible to have a fully planned sort of a city, and there's issues of race and so on and so forth. And then in the post-colonial time, it's the same thing too. You have to allow certain city to remain informal, because informal is the way to sustain the formal, because you can't formalize everything. It's just too costly. The city just cannot grow by formalizing everything. It's too costly. Capitalists won't want it. The state just have no capacity to do that. So therefore, you have to allow some informality to grow in order to allow capital and the contradictions of the city to be stabilized. So in some way, it's a purposefully unplanned city. But in a very strange way, that component of unplanned city allow some interesting spaces for people to live. And this is why I'm with you in that sense. So there's an inner contradiction going on in the city that allow all kind of a possibility to exist. The one thing that is fascinating about Jakarta is that there are a lot of unpredictability in the daily life. And some people say this is really quite scary too. You know, it's overstimulation. But at the same time, this is why it is interesting. You in a strange way, you don't want a city where everyone has got something. Everyone is got to be regularized, and everything is predictable. You can even calculate the time. You know, if I want to go to that place, I just need to provide 15 minutes. Jakarta, no, you have to create some anxiety. You know, maybe I need an hour. But that is what life means to them, and that's why it's exciting. You know, you can find an excuse too. And that is what we call soul, in a very strange way. You know, I think if a city becomes so regularized, I think you lost that soul. So I think in some ways, hope should come, you know, from that direction. Now, to go back to that hopefulness that Johannes in mind, for people who are very keen on planning, right, they just cannot stand that. And they want to have something to plan, you know, and therefore, the way to plan is maybe to find a new space to plan. But they know the real space is there in that unplanned sort of environment. So I think that is important for us to think about Jakarta. So
on that note, let me wrap up this conversation. One of the key takeaways is that we do have some signs of hope, and also maybe even justifying that the existing situation is quite hopeful, depending on which way you look at. But one key message that came about in this is that the future of cities is something not easy to plan and prepare vis-a-vis an existing model, because the global terrain that we have now is so volatile, one. Another is the Asian values that are coming up because of the growing middle class that is coming out in Asia, India and China. They're going to shape a new global scenario, and that is what the Global Asia Institute is keenly researching about. And the third point that comes about is that the basic services like water, sanitation, and also housing, these are going to be determining factors. One way or other, we have to give it to them. And as Mike was saying, they are shrinking cities. That is, cities which don't consciously address these, people will move to other city centers are not yet cities, smaller towns, which will grow into the new cities that will come, and that we are seeing that all over Asia. So on that note, let me wrap it up, and let's give a round of applause to the speaker and Abhijit.